Good afternoon, Fantasy Nation. It's your boy JohnnyFreakInFantasy here on the Week 10 Waiver Wire podcast. Today we have 36 players to discuss, 21 being offensive and 15 defensive. With only 5 weeks left in the season, this is where waiver wire crunching gets really important. You want to make sure you're picking up the right guys. I did the hours upon hours of research for you, so no need to read any articles on the internet, look anything up, because I got what you need. So we're going to move along to our first segment, which is running backs. I don't have any quarterbacks to discuss this week. I have a lot of players that I need to talk to you about, so we're going to move into running backs. The first running back this week is Mike Davis from Seattle, still only owned in 25% of Yahoo leagues. He was the leading rusher and receiver in Week 9 for Seattle, while Chris Carson battled through hip and thigh injuries. He's not coming completely out of the blue, as we saw in Week 4. He rushed for over 100 yards. In Week 10, he's going to get the Rams. LA Rams is his matchup, so I'm not scaring away from him, even though Rams are a solid defense. I really do like him. I think the volume's going to be there for Mike Davis to be successful. I think he's a solid flex or a running back 3. And if you're looking for help immediately, I think he's the guy you need to run and go get. I think that in the right volume and the right matchup, hopefully they're not going to be trailing. Seattle's going to be in that game with the Rams, so hopefully he's going to get a lot of touches. I think Mike Davis is a solid pickup. I'm not too worried about the rookie Rashad Penny, although I do like him long term. I don't think he hurts Mike Davis's value this week, although he might get a couple touches, especially if Carson's out. I don't expect Carson to play, and I do think that Mike Davis, even if Carson does somehow suit up, I think we've seen, because it's Week 9, he was the leading rusher and receiver. He has dual abilities in that offense, and I really do think that he has earned himself a role. He's kind of poked through before, and now I think he's trying to show that it's not a fluke. So I think Mike Davis, number 1 running back to add this week. Going into number 2, Duke Johnson from Cleveland, owned in 49% of Yahoo leagues. General rule of thumb, I don't talk about guys who are owned in more than 50% of leagues, so this is probably going to be my last week talking about Duke Johnson. There's a lot of speculation going into the week that his snaps could increase with the offensive coordinator change there, and indeed that's what we saw. He had 9 receptions for 78 yards and 2 touchdowns in Week 9, as well as a rush for 8 yards. And I think he has a great matchup in Week 10 versus Atlanta. They allow the most passing yards to running backs out of the backfield, so I think he's in a great spot for success. I think it's a good gamble as a flex play. I think maybe if he shows up again and has another 5 or 6 catches this week versus Atlanta, I think you could probably pencil him into a RB2, mid-range RB2 in PPR especially. So I think there is good upside in Duke Johnson. I think more long-term, he is a better add than Mike Davis, but I do think for Week 10 specifically speaking, I think that Mike Davis is my preferred running back to own there. Now, there is some risk here with Duke Johnson. I still think that Nick Chubb is going to be the preferred back there in Cleveland. He's still the lead dog. We've seen Duke Johnson kind of come and go, although he's, especially in PPR, he's been a factor before. Before coming into this week, in Week 9, he saw his lowest snap total of the year with 36. So I don't think that he's a shoo-in for success, but I think it's a great gamble, and I think he can probably build off his success and become more consistent in that offense with the offensive coordinator change. Coming in at number 3 is Josh Adams from Philadelphia, only owned in 11% of Yahoo leagues, probably in part due to he was on bye this past week in Week 9, but he had 13 rushes for 78 yards over his last 2 games. He looks to take the lead back on early downs in Philadelphia, and I do like him as a physical and strong back. I think this is a preferable wait-and-see approach. I think if you can pick him up, if you have a spot you can burn, I think he's a great pickup this week. He has a tough 10 matchup versus Dallas, so I'm not expecting RB2 volume right away, but I do think he can offer that if he does somehow pick up more snaps and show more consistency in this offense. I think Wendell Smallwood still has a role, especially on passing downs, but I think they're going to try to run with Josh Adams and see what they have in the undrafted free agent before trying to exploit other options. Coming in at number 4, Elijah McGuire from the New York Jets, owned in 14% of Yahoo leagues. He made his season debut in Week 9 and made good on it with 7 rushes for 30 yards, as well as 3 catches for 37 yards. And while the yardage wasn't much on either end, we've seen the confidence he has in both the rushing game and receiving game, and the confidence that the Jets have in him, especially in his first game back. They gave him the opportunity. I think he's a great talent. I think overall the opportunity is going to be there for him to seize kind of that Bilal Powell role, especially in PPR leagues. I do like Elijah McGuire. I think the receivers' health is a concern overall in New York. I think Enunwa is no shoe-in to get healthy. He might suffer a setback. We've seen Robbie Anderson hampering. They're looking for pass catchers so much that Chris Herndon is their leading receiver in Week 9. So I do think that Elijah McGuire offers running back 3 value, and especially in PPR, I would consider him a flex. Number 5 is Wendell Smallwood from Philadelphia, owned in 39% of Yahoo leagues. I talked about Josh Adams earlier here, and I think that he is going to get the first crack, but I think that if he falters, he's no shoe-in for success. I think that if he falters, Wendell Smallwood is the backup plan, and I think that he's shown enough success in the past to make the Philadelphia Eagles confident that he can carry the mail if need be. But I think right now he's kind of a passing back in that offense. Although he has a role, I think the Adams experiment is a solid one. I think that he's going to pay dividends for owners to pick him up, as well as the Philadelphia Eagles. I think that Josh Adams, although is the better ad, I could see Wendell Smallwood paying off in PPR leagues, returning flex value. And in standard leagues, I would consider him a running back 3. So Wendell Smallwood, not somebody that I'm burning a top waiver on by any means, maybe not even burning a waiver at all, but somebody who I won't let go unowned coming Wednesday. Moving on, number 6, Deontay Foreman from Houston, owned in 13% of Yahoo leagues. And he has a bye week coming up in Week 10, so this is not a startable option. This is somebody who I would consider a stash, a deep stash, for that matter. It looks like he will try to come back for Week 11, however. I think that the fact that Lamar Miller has kind of burst on the scene and rejuvenated himself a little bit has hurt the anticipation of Deontay Foreman coming back. However, we've seen the roller coaster kind of go downhill for Lamar Miller last week, and I do think right now, if you have a bench spot and you are a team who is heading for the playoffs, I think that Deontay Foreman is a good speculative ad for you. If you can hang on to him for a week or two and afford somebody who might not play until Week 12 even, I think that he might be a good investment. It's no shoe-in. I don't think it's a guarantee that he's going to run wild with the ball when he comes back, but I do think that Houston is looking good as an offense. We all know that, and I do think they need a solid running back to fit the bill, kind of complete that offense. I don't think it's Lamar Miller still. I think Deontay Foreman is the better ad. So if you are hurting at running back or you're a team that can afford to drop somebody, don't let Deontay Foreman go unowned. Finally, number 7 at running back, Theo Riddick from Detroit, owned in 9% of Yahoo leagues. He's somebody who I probably wouldn't have talked about had Golden Tate not been traded, but the past is the past, and Theo Riddick came onto the scene, caught 7 of 8 targets for 36 yards in Week 9. I'm not really a fan of him, even in PPR, but I'm only going to touch him in PPR. If it's not PPR, I'm not picking him up. I'm not adding him up. So if you're in a standard league, don't even worry about Theo Riddick. But if it's PPR and you are throwing darts, then I think you could do worse than Theo Riddick. He's probably going to get us 5 to 6 targets a game. I don't think that he's going to be someone you can depend on. Maybe just start in flex if you're hurting at running back for a week or two. But if you're in PPR and you're down this low, Theo Riddick might be someone to consider for Week 10. That's all for the running backs. We're going to move over to wide receivers now. My number 1 wide receiver ad for Week 10 is Marquez Valdes-Scantling from Green Bay, owned in 39% of Yahoo leagues. This is somebody who led the Packers in receiving versus the Patriots even after being shut out the first half. He's had 100 yards or a touchdown in 4 straight games. He just keeps showing up and making plays week in and week out. And if you didn't hear, Geronimo Allison may need surgery, so I do think that he's going to be out for an extended period of time. I do see Marquez Valdes-Scantling locked in as the wide receiver 2 in that offense next to Devontae Adams. I think he's in a great spot for success. Anyone in that offense who's getting nice looks and making plays for Aaron Rodgers is going to continue to get looks. So I do think he is a wide receiver 3 with wide receiver 2 upside. He is a solid flex, not only in PPR, but standard leagues as well, due to the touchdown ability he has. I'm not really as high on other people as him because I do think there's another name to consider here. I think Jake Kumaro, somebody who showed well in the preseason and somebody who Aaron Rodgers has talked up and praised since the preseason. I think that because of this Geronimo Allison injury, they're probably going to bring Jake Kumaro on and sign him to the roster at some point. So I think that's a deep waiver wire ad and somebody who I'm not even going to consider as Jake Kumaro this week. But I do think you want to keep that name on your watch list because he can kind of be a Jordy Nelson of sorts in that offense, especially if you get talked up so much by Aaron Rodgers. So I do think right now Marquez Valdes-Scantling is a shoo-in as the number one wide receiver ad for Week 10. But keep an eye on Jake Kumaro because he could make strides coming back from injury later in the season here. Number 2 is Christian Kirk from Arizona, only owned in 26% of Yahoo leagues. This is somebody who's averaged 6.5 targets and 63 receiving yards over his last 6 games. Before the bye, Week 8, he had 3 catches for 42 yards and a touchdown, and that was a game-winning touchdown. At worst, he looks to be the number 2 receiver in that offense, and he looks to be Josh Rosen's go-to. He's played 75% of snaps in multiple games now, and coming up, he's got Kansas City and Oakland, some of the most generous passing defenses. So I do think Christian Kirk, he might have been somebody who was dropped due to the bye. Get him immediately because he can pay dividends down the stretch for you. Number 3 is DJ Moore from Seattle, owned in 16% of Yahoo leagues. He came out big in weeks 5 through 8. I talked about him for the last 4 podcasts, but he kind of fell off last week in week 9. He only had 2 catches for 16 yards. However, I'm not scurrying away here. He had 7 targets that game, and that was the most he's ever had. So I think that the fact that he had 7 targets, a few were his red zone targets. He's kind of been a touchdown-dependent player upon Week 9, but looks like that he's going to cement more of a full-time role. I don't think he's going away anytime soon. So in a good matchup versus the Rams in Week 10, I would consider him a flex or a wide receiver 3. And I think he has value with room to grow. I think right now it's a better start outside of PPR because, like I said, this seven targets he's had Week 9 was the most he's ever seen. But if that's something that is going to be a norm, I think that he would be a great add in PPR for the rest of the season. Coming in at number 4, Traquan Smith from New Orleans, 28% owned. Again, someone who I've been talking about in my past podcasts. He found pay dirt in Week 9. He had 2 catches for 23 yards and a touchdown. He might have been dropped in your league, so look to see if he was. And if he was dropped, go ahead and pick him back up. Over the last 4 games, he's secured 3 touchdowns, and I think he's going to continue to build rapport with Drew Brees down in New Orleans. He gets Cincinnati this week, who has allowed more passing yards per game than anyone else to this point. I would consider him a wide receiver 3, at least a solid flex option in standard leagues. He's not as appealing in PPR leagues, however, but I do think in PPR leagues he is startable. Coming in at number 5, Maurice Harris from Washington, only owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. Harris secured 10 catches for 124 yards on 12 targets in Week 9. He played in replace of Jamison Crowder. He hasn't completely came out of nowhere, as the last 4 games he had 11 catches for 102 yards before his Week 9 breakout. So I think the fact that Jamison Crowder was ruled out early on Thursday last week going into Week 9 bodes well for Maurice Harris's fantasy value here, although it does not bode well for Crowder's. I do think that Maurice Harris gets an additional boost with Paul Richardson requiring season-ending surgery. That was just mentioned a few days ago out of nowhere. So I do think Maurice Harris is not just a flash in the pan. I think he has room to grow in that offense. And I think in Week 10 when he plays Tampa Bay, who allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, it's going to be a nice additional matchup for him to showcase what he can do on that offense. So for Week 10 specifically, I would consider Maurice Harris a wide receiver 3 and a solid flex play. And an additional boost in PPR. He had 10 catches for 124 yards. So I think this is somebody who's going to get some volume, get a chance to show what he's about. So Maurice Harris, nice pickup from Washington if you're hurting at receiver or if you're looking to maybe establish and bolster your receiving core. I think that he is a solid add this week. Coming in at number 6, Adam Humphries from Tampa Bay, only owned in 2% of Yahoo leagues. This is somebody who broke out with 8 catches for 82 yards and 2 touchdowns in Week 9. And while these were his first 2 touchdowns of the season, over the last 4 games, he's caught 22 catches for 277 yards and 2 touchdowns. As well, in PPR over those last 4 games, he's averaged over 10 fantasy points per game. And while he's not going to score 20 or 30 like he did this past week, week 9 every week, I think a consistent 10 here is what you're looking at. I would tread with caution. There are many mouths to feed in Tampa Bay. You've got Chris Godwin, O.J. Howard. We saw had a big game. Mike Evans was limping. Deshaun Jackson. But I do think that Adam Humphries, he has established himself, especially in PPR, as a nice floor. Although not a really high ceiling, but he does have a nice consistent floor with an average of 10. So 31 targets over the last 4 games. You could do a lot worse than that. The volume's there. I would consider him a wide receiver 4 with wide receiver 3 upside. A great PPR flex at worst this week versus Washington week 10. So someone to consider, especially in a deep league. Adam Humphries might be your go-to. Coming in at number 7, Quincy Enunwa from the New York Jets, owned in 12% of Yahoo leagues. Enunwa finally got back and healthy in week 9, only securing 3 catches for 40 yards. Although he does have a tough matchup in week 10 versus Buffalo, he might see some Tre'Davious White. I do like him for the rest of the season, so I'm not advising to start here in week 10. He's more of a wait-and-see, pick-up-and-hold kind of guy. But we can't overlook those first 4 weeks with Sam Darnold while they were looking to establish rapport and they were both healthy. Enunwa caught 21 passes for 278 yards and a touchdown, so I would not write him off yet. He could be a great long-term add, especially in PPR if he gets that kind of volume back with Darnold. So I think right now he's like a wide receiver 4, but with eventual wide receiver 2 upside. Number 8 is Tyrell Williams from the LA Chargers, owned in 45% of Yahoo leagues. This is likely going to be the last time I'll mention him on this podcast. He'll probably eclipse 50% owned after this week. Week 9, he caught 2 balls for 23 yards and a touchdown. And don't forget, over the last 4 weeks, he's had 12 catches for 325 yards and 4 touchdowns. So those are actually, I would consider those to be wide receiver 2 stats. So although I'm not considering Tyrell Williams to be a wide receiver 2, I do think he's going to get a tasty matchup with Oakland next. He's the kind of a home run hitter, a big play threat at any given time. So I think he's a good bye-week plug-in. Even if I had Tyrell Williams, I'd be trying to sell him at all costs right now. I think he's a great sell-high kind of guy. So somebody who's maybe hurting a wide receiver, you have good incentive and good rapport, good history with him. Just tell the owners, hey, look at the last 3 weeks, what he's done. So I think right now he's a great wide receiver 3 in standard leagues. Only 22 catches on the year, so I wouldn't consider him to be a wide receiver 3 in PPR. More of a wide receiver 4. But right now, I think he's on a high note. Trade him if you can, or pick him up and start him if you are hurting at receiver. There are worse options on waivers. Number 9 is Cordarrelle Patterson from New England, owned in 6% of Yahoo leagues. We watched him rush 11 times for 61 yards and a touchdown, and he looked pretty good doing it too. When James White went out, he made a nice drive and gave the Patriots 50 yards rushing in relief of James White. And I do think while we expect Sonny Michel to return this week, I wouldn't bank on it. I think if the Patriots need to, they will be optimistic and keep him out another game if need be. They don't want to re-injure that injury for Michel. He's their star running back. So I think that right now Cordarrelle Patterson should have a passing game role at least out of the backfield, something like a Ty Montgomery usage from Green Bay. So I do think that we would have to see Sonny Michel practice regularly this week without setbacks in order to play. The Patriots are 6-2. They don't want to risk the health of Michel, so I don't think that's a given. So I think after breaking records for most rushing yards by a wide receiver in team history, so I do think the recent success of Cordarrelle Patterson will get him some more looks in that Patriots offense. Finally, for my wide receivers, number 10, Keke Coutee from Houston, owned in 26% of Yahoo leagues. He's on bye week 10, so he's considered a stash here. I'm not burning any waivers to get him. He might not even be fully healthy coming off bye. There was talks they want to activate him and have him full go by week 11. He might have to sit an additional game out, but I do think maybe not this week, for next week, if you want to have somebody, a nice stash who can be a nice PPR asset down the line, I think there is room in this Texans offense for Keke Coutee. He's especially good out of the backfield, getting looks in multiple facets, and I think he's effective when healthy. So definitely not somebody to pick up and start this week because he's going to be on bye. So somebody to pick up for the future if you have maybe a space you can drop, somebody that got injured and you don't have bye week issues this week, Kiki Kuti might be a guy you take a look at. I'm going to move over to the tight ends now. And my number one tight end this week from Denver, although he's on bye this week, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues, and that is Jeff Heuerman. We saw Demaryius Thomas get traded, and we were all wondering how were targets going to be distributed. And it looked like Jeff Heuerman was the main beneficiary of that, securing 10 of 11 targets for 83 yards as well as a touchdown. He was the leading receiver in all categories. And while tight end is kind of a dead zone outside of the top 5 or 10, I wouldn't hesitate to pick up Jeff Heuerman. Even though he's not going to play this week, I think he's worth the pickup in hopes of the success will continue. Hopefully we'll see some consistency. I don't know about 10 to 12 targets every game, or catches for that matter, but I think as far as tight end goes, especially how scarce the position is, I would consider him a back-end tight end 1 upon his return to the lineup after Week 10 bye. At number 2 is Jack Doyle from Indianapolis, owning 40% of Yahoo leagues. He's somebody who came off injury before going on bye in Week 8. We saw him secure 6 targets for 70 yards and a touchdown in return from that injury. He didn't take a backseat to Eric Ebron, which was impressive. I thought maybe that was going to be the case. So I think both Jack Doyle and Eric Ebron, until further notice, are safe mid-range tight end 1s in a tough matchup versus Jacksonville this week. Number 3, someone I've talked about last couple podcasts, Chris Herndon from the New York Jets, owning 13% of Yahoo leagues. In Week 9, he was the Jets' leading receiver in both receptions and yards. Sam Darnold completed all 4 targets to him. Over the last 4 games, Herndon has caught 11 passes for 180 yards and 3 touchdowns. I would consider him as a high floor, low ceiling. I think he's a pretty safe play. At this point, he's probably going to get you 8 to 10 points, nothing more, nothing less, which is a pretty solid fill-in for the bye or injury at tight end. You could do a lot worse there. I think Quincy Enunwa getting healthy could affect him for better or for worse even. I don't think that Enunwa coming back is going to necessarily take targets against Chris Herndon. I think he might even open some space up for Herndon and vice versa. So I do think getting Enunwa back, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays itself out. But at least for this week, Week 10, I think Chris Herndon is a nice, safe play, again, if you're hurting at tight end. And number 4, final tight end on my list is Logan Thomas from Buffalo. He's owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. He was a former quarterback at Virginia Tech. Struggled a little bit with Arizona before making the transition to tight end. I think he's got good potential at the tight end position. He started this week, Week 9, over Charles Clay, who had a hamstring injury, and produced with 8 catches for 40 yards. So he was getting targeted heavily in Buffalo. So I think with Buffalo hurting for able-bodied receivers, Logan Thomas, with the potential he has as a pass catcher, I think if Charles Clay sits again, he can be back on the mid-range tight end 1 map. Now it's time for individual defensive player, my defensive side of the podcast. I'm going to start off with defensive backs and then go into linebackers. So, as you know, you've probably heard the saying, defense wins championships. Now's getting that time, no matter if you're a shallow IDP league or a deep IDP league, now's the time to make the moves you need down the stretch. And there are a couple guys that I have for you this week that you should go pick up that were probably dropped. So my number 1 ad at defensive back for this week, Week 10, is Budda Baker from Arizona, owning 37% of Yahoo leagues. He was dropped in over 15% of Yahoo leagues due to this bye, Week 9. So I definitely would recommend picking him up. He is actually the highest scoring defensive back this season. He has amassed 72 tackles in 8 games. That's an average of 9 per game. I think you need to pick him up wherever he's available, no matter the scoring. He is an elite defensive back 1, and I do think Budda Baker for the rest of the season can definitely remain the top dog as far as defensive backs. So I think the playmaker needs to be picked up wherever he was dropped, no matter if your league's shallow, deep. Budda Baker is my number 1 defensive ad this week. Coming in at number 2 is Jesse Bates III from Cincinnati, owned in 17% of Yahoo leagues. He was also on bye in Week 9, but comes back this week with 60 tackles in 8 games. And specifically over his last 3 games, he's recorded 30 tackles and a pick 6. I think he's a staple in that Cincinnati defense who has a lot of questions at linebacker with health and play right now. I think he is solid DB1 status for the rest of the year. Jesse Bates, go pick him up. Coming in at number 3 from Arizona, another Cardinal, Trey Boston, owned in 5% of Yahoo leagues. He was dropped in majority of leagues due to his bye last week and injury concerns. He hasn't played since Week 6. But get this, over the first 6 games, he's had 40 tackles and 3 interceptions. And at the time, in Week 6, those 3 interceptions tied him for the league lead in interceptions. Now he has since been passed. However, a great start to the season for him before he went down with injury. It's still unknown if he's playing in Week 10 versus Kansas City. However, for Weeks 11 through the playoffs especially, he can be a great boost to your secondary. I think if you aren't depleted by buys or injury this week in Week 10, he is somebody that you need to pick up. Maybe not start, but like I said, Weeks 11 through the playoffs, somebody that can make a difference on your defensive side of the ball. Number 4, yet another Arizona Cardinal in the secondary, owning 18% of Yahoo leagues, and that is Antoine Bethea. The ageless wonder returns from bye in Week 9 with 67 tackles in 8 games. He's had 37 tackles his last 4 games with Trey Boston out. He should be at worst a mid-range defensive back 1 with Trey Boston back. And if Trey Boston does sit again, I would consider him a high-end defensive back 1. Coming in at number 5 from Carolina, Eric Reed, owned in 4% of Yahoo leagues. I've been preaching him the last 4 weeks. Over the last 3 games, 19 tackles, a sack, and an interception. He's a huge playmaker in that secondary. Has a lot of confidence. I would consider him a high-end DB2. He has a nice Week 10 matchup versus Pittsburgh Thursday night, so I wouldn't hesitate to add Eric Reed if you are hurting at defensive back for Week 10. Moving on, number 6, again, the Smash Brothers make another appearance. Justin Reed, Eric Reed's brother from Houston, again owned in 4% of Yahoo leagues. He's on bye Week 10, so he's not going to be an option for you this week. But over the last 3 games, Justin Reed has had 24 tackles. He's a playmaker in the secondary like his brother. Recovered a fumble. He's all over the field. Plays almost every single defensive snap. So Justin Reed, an elite defensive back who I think for the rest of the season is very overlooked. Someone who you need to go and get now before people put the pieces together. So I think Justin Reed is my number 6 defensive back, is a strong add. Moving on, number 7 is TJ McDonald from Miami, only owned in 3% of Yahoo leagues. In Week 9, for whatever reason, we saw Rashad Jones lead the field. He removed himself from the field, and TJ McDonald benefited with 9 tackles. He's had 23 tackles his last 4 games. While he's not a huge playmaker, I would consider him as a mid-range defensive back 2 with a high floor but a low ceiling. I think he's pretty consistent at around 8 to 10 a game you can bank on. Any more than that is kind of over his average, but I think he is capable of it. So you could do a lot worse in a bind than TJ McDonald. Number 8 is Josh Jones from Green Bay, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. This is perhaps somebody you're not going to pick up this week, but a kind of bench stash or a watch list kind of player. This is a second-year player out of NC State. He got good playing time in Week 9. He had 6 tackles, made the most of it. I would definitely monitor him. Since Clinton-Dix has been traded to Washington, I think there's going to be a lot of questions in that secondary. Can Tremont Williams fill that void at safety? We'll see. But for right now, I think Josh Jones is somebody who you need to consider picking up later in the season. In 2017, last year as a rookie, he made 71 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, and a pick. And that was, of course, at safety. And I think he could be a solid defensive back too if given the opportunity to. I think he's hungry to get more looks in that defense. I think Josh Jones, not very valid of a pickup, but right now somebody you definitely want to put on your watch list and keep eyes on. And finally, number 9 defensive back is from Kansas City, Daniel Sorensen, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. He's not going to be an option for you Week 10 versus Arizona. It's not a good matchup. He's just being activated, but he could be a good option very soon for you. This is a 14-game starter in 2017. Last year, 89 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, a pick. He returned a touchdown. So he is a big playmaker. He was activated this week. Hopefully he's going to play Week 10. This is a guy you want to put on your watch list. I think he's a high-end DB2 potentially for this Kansas City defense who has been struggling to fill the void of Eric Berry since he hasn't been able to come back from injury. That's it for the defensive backs. Now I'm going to shift over to linebacker. And my number 1 linebacker add this week from Dallas is only owned in 13% of Yahoo leagues, and he's here because of injury reasons, and that is Leighton Vander Esch. So in Week 9, we saw him with 9 tackles. Big beneficiary with Sean Lee back on the Pine, riding the Pine, injured again. Looks like he re-injured his hamstring. So Leighton Vander Esch immediately goes back into mid-range LB1 status. I think he's going to be a force in the middle of that field. I don't know if Sean Lee's going to come back early or he's really going to heal up this time. so I think he should be out for an extended period of time. In the 8 games this season that he's played, Leighton Vander Esch, 63 tackles. I think he should step up long and short term. I'd consider him a mid-range LB1, Week 10 versus Philadelphia, and the rest of the season. I think that he is a great candidate. If he were starting or Lee was not there, we might be talking about him as Defensive Rookie of the Year. So I think Leighton Vander Esch, although he kind of got put on the back burner for a while and might have been dropped, he's somebody who warrants LB1 status moving forward. Number 2 is Deion Jones from Atlanta. He was my number 1 defensive ad last week. Still only owned in 11% of Yahoo leagues. So I think that he's probably not going to play this week. Looks like that he's still lingering. His injury, that broken foot he had following his activation. Coach Dan Quinn has kind of been nonchalant when asked questions about him. He's not giving a straight answer. So I do think probably you're going to sit him this week if you pick him up. This is going to be a Week 11 at best start. But to me, he's still my number 2 ad because even though he's having complications with that foot coming back, this is a guy who registered 136 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 10 pass defense, 3 picks. He's somebody who can set the pace for your fantasy defense. He's a high-end LB1 upon his healthy arrival. I think Deion Jones doesn't need to go another week or another day on the waiver wire. Pick him up, and hopefully he does wonders for you down the stretch. Coming in at number 3, somebody who was on bye this week, Josh Bynes, another Arizona Cardinal, only owned in 14% of Yahoo leagues. Over the last 8 games, he has registered 61 tackles. So I think coming back off bye, he was somebody who was probably dropped in a lot of leagues. He's a solid low-end LB1 for the rest of the year. I think there's a lot of tackles to be made there in Arizona. He's the most stable, dependent linebacker they have right now. So I think Josh Bynes warrants a pickup in your leagues. Moving on to number 4, somebody who also might have been dropped due to injury from Cleveland, owned in 11% of leagues, and that's Joe Scobert. He hasn't played since Week 6, but he's been an IDP monster last year and this year. He had 49 tackles in his first 6 games, and I think with Chris Kirksey ailing too, I think that they're going to need Joe Scobert to come back. So if he's not going to, he might be at risk to not play this week. So move him down in the ranks if that's the case. But if he does play, I would consider him a low-end LB1 versus Kansas City in his first game back. My number 5 linebacker ad is Mark Barron from the LA Rams. He's owned in 34% of Yahoo leagues. Over the last 2 games, he's returned to his form with 13 total tackles. He gets Seattle in a nice matchup, who has allowed the second most fantasy points to linebackers this season in Week 10. I would consider him a low-end LB1 because of the presence of Corey Littleton. Although I do like them both, I do think that both are startable. I would rank Corey Littleton a little bit higher than Mark Barron. So if he's in your IDP leagues, definitely go pick him up. But I think he's probably scooped by now. Mark Barron, he's returning to form. Somebody who is a freak athlete, somebody who can play a lot of different positions, very versatile, can run with runners, go sideline to sideline. So Mark Barron, as he gets more healthy, more snaps, I think they're going to rely on him a little bit more. So I think he's a nice pickup at number 5 this week. And number 6, KJ Wright from Seattle, owned in 6% of Yahoo leagues. In the last 2 games, coming back from injury, he's registered 12 total tackles. He gets the Rams in Week 10. I would consider him moving forward a high-end LB2. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all for Week 10 of Johnny Freakin' Fantasy Waiver Wire Podcast. Hope you like what you heard. If you do, go give me a follow on Twitter at JohnnyFreakInF1. Go ahead and follow me. That is, again, at JohnnyFreakInF1. I appreciate your listens, your subscriptions, your follows. As always, good luck in Week 10. We will see you next week on Week 11.